We're accustomed to live within the limits of a certain world picture. When we find ourselves inside of such a familiar picture, even though it's complicated, it seems to be simple. We enjoy living in comfort, not only materially, but also intellectually. To live among familiar concepts, notions and images. Intrusion of some new picture in our minds can cause our discontent. Often as not, such discontent is transformed psychologically into a resistance to new as something too complicated. So are you ready to let this new picture of the world in your mind? If your answer is yes, get ready to learn about the unique features of capitalism as a social system, the main contradictions of the capitalist system, dynamics and logic of capitalist development, the role of secret societies in the development of capitalist system, why the end of capitalism is inevitable, the plans of global elites to overcome the current crisis. The film is based on one of the lectures of Russian historian, sociologist, political scientist and researcher Andrey Fursov, named Capitalism, the terminal crisis of the most enigmatic social system. I'm going to tell you things which are rather simple. But the problem is that simple things are sometimes more difficult to explain and understand than complicated ones. The reason for that, not the only but a very important one, is the fact that we're accustomed to live within the limits of a certain world picture. When one is inside of such a familiar picture, even in case it's complicated, it seems to be simple. People do like to live in comfort not only materially, but also intellectually, to live among familiar concepts, notions and images. The intrusion of some new picture can lead to a kind of discontent. Often as not, such discontent is transformed psychologically into a resistance to new, as something too complicated. Nowadays, the situation is aggravated by the growing breakup between social science and social reality on the one hand, and between education in social science and social scientific research on the other. Especially it concerns history, historical studies which during the last 20-30 years have been becoming more and more detheorized, being and more transformed into empirical case studies, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's no coincidence that it's precisely in the Anglo-Saxon world intelligence services like MI6, CIA, the Five Eyes, together with historical departments of leading universities, started a program of preparation of historians which are needed now. Historians who are studying big structures, large-scale processes and compare different systems and agents. Historians of at least two new professions are being prepared: a system historian and an investigative historian. The latter is a specialist who analyzes indirect consequences and poses naive questions. For example, we're told that in July 1918, the Russian ex-Tsar Nicholas II, his family, servants and doctor, 11 persons in total, were led to a certain room. Then 7 men came in and began shooting. The naive question is, what was the size of the room? Could 18 persons fit in there? A system historian is a specialist on the history of social systems, which as a field of study is a theory of systems at the same time. In this case, history and theory are inseparable. Today we shall speak about one such system, capitalism, which has found itself in a deep systemic, I would say, terminal crisis. I'm going to touch several topics: the unique features of capitalism as a social system, the main contradictions of the capitalist system, the dynamics and the logic of capitalist development, the place of the USSR as of systemic anti-capitalism in the capitalist system, the role of Soviet elites in the 1960s, 1980s in the degradational social evolution which started at that time, and finally the plans of global elites to overcome the current crisis. It's difficult to cover such a range of themes in one lecture, but I think that sometimes it's very useful to have a view from height. As the American scientist and science fiction writer Isaac Asimov used to say, it's useful to begin with a general view. The term crisis became standard in our days. We're speaking about the crisis of economy, the crisis of world political system, the crisis of ideologies, and the crisis of scholarship, which means crisis of everything, or total crisis. But then a question arises: crisis of which totality? This totality is the capitalist system, capitalism. Many people have been speaking of the crisis of capitalism for the last 25 or 30 years. Since 2008, the phrase "the crisis of capitalism" became almost commonplace and to some extent official. In 2012, Dr. Schwab, the organizer of the Davos Forum, said that capitalism didn't correspond to the existing, contemporary world, while Jacques Attali, and not only he, is analyzing possible variants of post-capitalism future. Those people who discuss the crisis of capitalism presume that we understand properly what capitalism is. At the first glance, it seems that capitalism really is a very simple system to understand and analyze. Almost all its features can be defined quantitatively and expressed in the form of statistics: GDP, GNP, income, level of consumptions, etc. No mystery at all. But I think it's an illusion. Usually we're accustomed to regard as enigmatic ancient societies like ancient Egypt with its pyramids, ancient China with its Great Wall, or the ancient Maya with their temples and mysterious hieroglyphics. Yet to my mind, it's precisely not ancient but modern phenomenon. Capitalism, which defined and determined modernity, is the most enigmatic social system. It has several distinct features which are absent from any other social system. First, capitalism is the only system of world scale. It's really a world system. Its production relations and system of exchange in the market encompasses the whole globe. Second, capitalism is the only social system that exists in several technological forms: pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial, or rather hyper-industrial ones. Third, capitalism is the only social system creating social forms which differ from it qualitatively, pre-capitalist ones. Where capital is not confronted by hired labor, it creates such forms which never existed in this or that region before capitalism, like plantation slavery in American South and the Caribbean, quasi-feudal latifundias in South America, private property without capitalism in Bengal. As a result, we have a paradox. In the world system of mature capitalism, in the middle of the 19th century, there were more pre-capitalist modes of production than in the 16th or 17th centuries. World capitalist system was not a homogeneous capitalist entity, but a heterogeneous multimode of production system. Fourth, capitalism is the only system which can exist both in positive capitalism and negative systemic anti-capitalism forms. Systemic anti-capitalism was represented in the 20th century by the USSR, by the world socialist system. Fifth, capitalism gives birth to phenomena earlier unknown and not needed in any other social system, and institutionalizes them: private property, state, civil society, science, nation, and ideology. One can exclaim, how is that possible? All these phenomena existed before capitalism. Look at great empires. Are they not states? Look at, say, the Indians. Are they not a nation? Or look at ancient Rome. Did it not know private property? Don't these phenomena look like state, nation, etc.? My answer to that question is definitely no. A shark, an ichthyosaurus, and a whale look similar, have almost the same shape and live in the water, yet they belong to absolutely different classes of creatures: fish, reptiles, and mammals. As for private property, it can exist only as a function of a private person as a social individual. Physically, we all are individuals, but as a rule it's only in bourgeois society a physical and a social individual is one and the same. In pre-colonial India, it was caste which was a social individual, a clan in traditional China, or a polis in ancient Greece. In ancient Rome, a man was holding property not as a private person, but as a paterfamilias, as a distinct and constantly existing phenomenon. A private person emerged with the dissolution of feudalism in the 15th, 16th centuries and is institutionalized in the 16th, 17th centuries in early bourgeois society, or the modern society. A state is the form of social violence, differentiated from relations of production and limited legally by a certain territory. In all pre-capitalist societies, social violence is an integral part of relations of production, hence a special organ of violence, a state, is simply not needed there. Centralized power fulfills a different function there, due to extra economic character of relations of production constituted by free exchange. In the bourgeois society of labor force, onto reified labor. Social violence is detached from relations of production and became autonomous. Contemporaries realized very well the difference between medieval polities of the 19th century and power structures of Henry VII in England and Louis XII in France in the second half of the 15th century, calling them new monarchies. But it was Machiavelli who invented and coined the term lo Stato, which later was taken by all major European languages: l'État, the state, der Staat. It took almost 150 years for the state to become a real institutional unit. In practice, it was done by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, in theory by Hobbes in his Leviathan Treaty in 1652. As for nation, we use this term to define such a group, a basic unit of which is an individual. Nation cannot consist of castes, clans, or some other collectivities. The loyalty to this or that traditional collectivity practically excludes the possibility of emergence of a nation. It's not a coincidence that the institutionalization of a nation took place in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, in Britain, France, and Germany respectively. From that point of view, a very interesting question is whether the Russians are a nation or just an ethnic group, people. Until the October Revolution, a basis unit of social organization in Russia was a community, while an individual Russian identified himself through religion, belonging to Orthodox Church. To be Russian meant to be Orthodox. In the USSR, there was proclaimed a new historical entity, the Soviet people, and the focus of collective loyalty for every Soviet citizen became supranational. That's why the process of nation formation of Russian people has not ended. It is still in the process. When we speak about science, first we should not confuse it with rational or empirical knowledge, and secondly, we must speak about social institutions. In all social systems before capitalism, rational knowledge institutionally was part of another, not very rational entity, religion. Only in the course of the so-called scientific revolution of the 17th century in Europe, which was part and parcel of the genesis of capitalism, we can speak of science as of a social institution in itself. I think the question of ideology is self-evident, and we come to the sixth and seventh features of capitalism, which are, to my mind, the most unique and important. So, the sixth, capitalism gives birth to and demands the existence of supranational forms of organization of structures of world coordination and governance. Sometimes they are called the deep state. These structures, groups, solve crucial contradictions of capitalism, and without them its normal functioning is hardly possible. One of the most important and significant contradictions of capitalism is that, from the economic point of view, capitalist world is a totality. It's a borderless zone of world market. But from the political point of view, it's not a whole, but a sum of states. So we have a triple contradiction: that between a sum and a totality, that between the economic organization and the political one, and that between the capital and state. The latter limits politically the world and the suprapolitical nature of capital. Capital, and especially big business, financial capital, has interests which transcend political or state and national borders. In order to realize them, capital often must violate the laws of its own country and the law of some other country as well. Once or twice by chance it's possible, but capital needs doing it systematically. Hence, for its normal functioning, it needs an organization, which is first supranational or superstate, secondly secret or at least closed, and thirdly has its distinct set of ideas or ideology, transcending both economy and politics, which in many cases means a cult. When bourgeoisie felt the necessity for such an organization, it had no specific type of organization of its own. Hence it took what was available, the Masonic lodges, which became the first form of deep power in capitalist society. From that time on, The development of the capitalist system and its North Atlantic core was also a development of this closed type of organization. Each major shift, major step in political and economic development of capitalism, of the formation of its North Atlantic ruling class, was at the same time the shift in the reorganization of closed structures. In the last quarter of the 19th century, Masonic structures ceased to be the main form of closed structures. New ones came out: Rhodes and Milner societies in England, das Geheime Deutschland in Germany. After the Second World War came a new wave of closed societies: the Bilderberg Club, Le Siècle, Le Cercle, the Club of Islands, the Club of Rome, and the Trilateral Commission. Now all these structures are in crisis, together with capitalism itself, and the transition to post-capitalist future will demand the emergence of a new type of closed organization. Perhaps what is mistakenly called deep state in the USA is an attempt to create such a new type. In 1870s, Marx remarked that if he had to write Das Kapital anew, analytically, he would start not with commodity and capital, but with state. I would say that if today we decide to write or rewrite or unwrite Das Kapital anew, we should start with suprastate, supranational state, closed or supranational closed structure. Otherwise, we risk to miss the most important things in political economy of capitalism. Seventh, the most important metaphysical, metahistoric distinction of capitalism is that development in capitalist system, at least since the middle of 18th century, acquires project construction character. The possibility to direct the course of history demands several factors. An organization which can pose, plan, prepare, realize in practice, and solve long-term historical tasks of large scale, like wars, revolutions, coups, etc. An adequate object, body of manipulation as a means, as a tools of geoconstructive activities, of geohistorical engineering. A financial base which ensures control over property and power. Control over information flows, especially those concerning upper and middle layers of society. And finally, the structure of rational knowledge, which analyzes regularities of history, mass processes, and social groups as fields of employment of project construction activities. A closed supranational organization, be it a Masonic one, the Rhodes Society, or Le Cercle, is precisely the type which is able to perform such activities. In the middle of the 18th century, there emerged in quite a surprising way an adequate object of manipulation, the masses, or the matter, a powerful financial basis, energy, and new forms of information flows. Information. Mass, or a sum of individuals, a lonely crowd, as Riesmans used to call it, was thrown from the villages to the cities and towns due to capitalist urbanization and industrialization. It became an adequate object of social manipulation. One can hardly manipulate primordial collectivities entrenched in small tradition and its values. The mid-18th century witnessed a financial explosion. It was an outcome of the financial revolution of the 17th century, which began by Standard Chartered Bank of Baruch family and ended with the Bank of England in 1694. Three factors brought need of great sums of money and hence financial explosion: the Anglo-French struggle for world hegemony, the colonial expansion of European states, and British proto-industrialization and industrialization. Evidently, bankers were important figures in closed supranational structures. Last but not least, the growing role of information, and as a consequence of information wars. The 18th century witnessed the rise of political role of information flows, organized and directed in a certain way. The French encyclopedia, influenced by British closed structures, was the first information or psychohistoric weapons of capitalist age. And of course science as an institution rationalized this type of information warfare. So, since mid-18th century, social matter, energy and information were accumulated in one hands, in the hands of supranational organizations. What is important, their interests largely coincided with the interests of Anglo-Saxon hegemonic states, Great Britain and the USA respectively, and with financial capital. Also important is that at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, open outer or first contour of power, parliaments, political parties and governments, became function of closed inner or the second and real one contour of power, like clubs, lodges, commissions, etc. So real power is hidden power. So we have the magnificent 7 features of capitalism, which imparted a unique and an enigmatic character. Now let's see how they realize themselves and reproduce the system as a whole, how they make it function, providing it with fantastic dynamism. But first we must follow René Descartes' advice. Il faut définir le sens des mots, meaning one should define the meaning of words, and give a working definition of capitalism. Capitalism is not just a linear triumph of capital and cannot be limited or reduced to capital only. Capital existed before the rise of capitalism, and in this or that form will exist after its demise. My working definition of capitalism as a system is following. Capitalism is a complicated social and institutional system which ensures constant accumulation of capital and time and its expansion in space, while at the same time limiting capital in its own long-term and holistic interests. Having no such limitation, capital would very soon eat to the end both society and nature, or biosphere. The means of limitation were state, civil society, politics and mass education. I would like to underline, they used to limit not capital as such, but its long-term and holistic interests, as opposed to partial and short-term, or at least medium-term ones. All the history of capitalism was a struggle against its limitations. In fact, it was a driving force of capitalism as a system, one of its main contradictions. And the chief arbiter between the sides, extremes, of this contradiction were of course closed supranational groups. So capitalism is not just capital, it's the unity of capital with its social institutional limitations under the control of suprastate, supranational closed groups whose main interest is not just capitalism, but power. Capitalism serves them as the means, but at the same time, they are the tool of self-correction and self-development of capitalist system. The whole picture reminds famous drawing by Escher called Relativity. And this is one more contradiction concerning capital. There are 3 possible variants of solution, or as Hegel would say, the Aufhebung of this contradiction. The first variant is precarious balance between sides, which characterizes normal, healthy capitalism. The 2 other, the destruction of any of the 2 sides of this contradiction, kills capitalism. The second variant is when means of limitation squeeze capital and get rid of it. This is the way the systematic anti-capitalism emerged from below, the Soviet socialism. We must stress that in the process of such annihilation, not only capital but also state, politics and civil society cease to exist. Principally, new social phenomena emerge. The third variant is when capital liquidates state, politics, civil society and mass education. That is anti-capitalism from above. It's precisely what has been happening in the West since mid-70s, when in 1975 there was published a report called The Crisis of Democracy, written by Huntington, Crozier and Watanuki at the request of the Trilateral Commission. This process has not reached its end yet, and we are to see the results within 20-30 years. Now, to the question of dynamics of capitalist system. Like antiquity and unlike feudalism, capitalism is an extensively organized system. Expansion is its mode of development, modus operandi. As a system and as a mode of production, capitalism presupposes the existence of a non-capitalist zone. Each time when the rate of world profit falls, the capitalist core carves some parts of the non-capitalist zone out of it and transforms them into a capitalist periphery. That is why the colonial expansion of capitalist system of the West was not a steady and constant process, but developed in spurts, each time making the non-capitalist zone smaller and smaller. By the end of the 20th century, with the destruction of the USSR and the rise of quasi-capitalist Russia, and with China becoming in fact also quasi-capitalist, non-capitalist zones in the world ceased to exist. The extensive development of capitalism was over. Is intensive development possible for capitalism? Will it in such case stay capitalist? Intensive development demands dismantling inner limitations of capital in its North Atlantic core. But without these limitations, capital is getting free of capitalism. It doesn't need it anymore. And I think that the crisis of the EU, the rise of the so-called populist parties in Europe, the Brexit, Trump in the US, the struggle between moderate and radical globalists are just a political reflection of this capitalist disintegration. I'm sure that many unexpected phenomena and rather strange surprises are awaiting us in the nearest future. The early 21st century, or rather its first half, marks a very important landmark in the history of capitalism, in its final, terminal stage. Let's have a look at the main stages of capitalist development. The long 16th century, from 1453 to 1648, was the period of the genesis of capitalism. As Hegel used to say, when a thing is emerging, it does not exist yet. So the genetic phase is in fact a pre-capitalist one. Then we have the early phase, roughly the 1650s, 1870s. The second, mature phase, from 1780s till 1910s, and the third phase, late capitalism, starting from 1910s and continuing until now. During the first two phases, or periods of its development, capitalism and its expansion covered the whole world. In the 19th century, the lost stride was the scramble for Africa. Further development presupposed conflicts not between the core and the periphery, but between core states and European semi-peripheral empires for the repartition of colonial periphery, which meant imperialist wars between European states. The driving force of development in these circumstances became the destruction of the industrial base of this or that core state or empire, and further development in the form of the after-war reconstruction of what had been destroyed. This means that at the end of the 19th, in the beginning of the 20th century, the economic dynamic of capitalism was in fact exhausted, became second factor. It was extra-economic dynamic which came to the foreground, became first and most important factor. The driving force of development of capitalist system after the First World War was the industrial reconstruction of the USSR and Germany. After the Second World War, it was the reconstruction of the USSR, Germany and Japan, hence economic miracles, the Soviet, the German and the Japanese. But by the early 1960s, all miracles were over. The development potentiality of the post-war reconstruction was finished. More than that, further industrial, economic and scientific, technological progress of core countries of the capitalist system became an obvious menace for dominant groups of core capitalism, because it was strengthening social and political positions of the middle class and of the upper layer of the working class. Social and political turbulence of the 1960s became a sign of trouble, of misfortune for the ruling circles of the capitalist system. Their reaction to this challenge of history took three main forms. First, they tried to slow down industrial and scientific technological progress in the name of ecology, of ecological menace. The leading role here was played by the Club of Rome, established in 1968, which proposed a concept of zero growth. It was not just an economic operation, but also a cultural, a psychohistoric one. For example, the Tavistock Institute was charged with the task to stamp out cultural optimism of the 60s. Very soon the place of science fiction was taken by fantasy literature. And if one compares scientific and technological inventions of the first half of the 20th century to that of the second half of the century, the picture will be the following. Plenty inventions in the first half and few, like mobile phones, internet and personal computers, in the second. We have real slowdown in scientific technological progress. The second direction was the counter-offensive of the upper classes against the middle class and the working class under a neoliberal banner. Thatcherism and Reaganomics became social weapons of the strong against the weak, an evident manifestation of the revolt of the elites, as opposed to the revolt of masses of the first half of the 20th century. Third, all these activities could be successful only in case the Soviet Union would not use the situation to its benefit. Hence the third direction was to neutralize the Soviet Union by false promising to integrate it into the capitalist world as an equal partner. The Soviet leadership was offered several attractions: cooperation in the sphere of global ecology, organization of the rise of oil price by means of the Arab-Israeli conflict, moon bargain, when the USSR was to admit the false American landing on the moon in exchange for Western technology, and the détente in world politics. The latter was absolutely necessary to the US as a respite, as a breathing space. Domestic political troubles, the war in Vietnam, and the economic situation pushed the US in this direction. The Russian economist Solomatin correctly recorded the fact that by 1968, the US ceased to be an economic complex, ceased to be a profitable and self-financing enterprise. In fact, in 1968, the US lost the economic competition to the USSR. The latter didn't win, but the former lost. The Soviet leadership didn't understand this, but the Chinese leadership did. And they proposed to help the US and the Federal Reserve System as if saying, "You need labor resources? We do have plenty of them. We are ready to help the American people. Transfer production to China. Give us progressive technologies, and hard labor of Chinese workers will cover your losses." And the Americans made a serious step in the Chinese direction at the end of the 70s, and it solved many of their problems. Indeed. But at the beginning of the 1970s, even though playing the Chinese card, they needed a détente with the USSR. First, to have a respite, and second, not to let the USSR use its advantages. So the Soviet leadership said yes to the Western offer, because at that moment in the second half of the 1960s, it in fact refused to perform a stride for anti-capitalism to post-capitalism. In other words, to what official party ideology termed as communism, and was looking for an alternative. It began to think about convergence with capitalism, hoping that it would be admitted to the world economy on equal terms. It was precisely this choice which led the USSR to a catastrophe. There was a serious problem with the Soviet system. Being a negation of capitalism in the sphere of relations of production, the Soviet system had as its material basis the same system of production as capitalism did. To transform itself from anti-capitalism to post-capitalism, the USSR had to solve three problems. 1. To create a principally new system of economic management as a necessary condition for a new system of production with a higher level of productivity. 2. To create a principally new system of energy, more powerful and less expensive than that based on oil. And 3. To create a military technological defense to fulfill the first and second tasks. Did the USSR in the mid-1960s have a possibility and a potential to solve these problems and really to outpass the stagnating capitalist West, the USA? Yes, it had. In the first half of the 1960s, under the guardianship of academician Glushkov, there was created the National Automized Systems for Computation and Information Processing, or GAS. It made possible scientific and cybernetic governance of society, in fact transforming it into an information society. At the same time, a group of social scientists under the guardianship of Filemonenko finished the work of creating installations for cold thermonuclear synthesis. In fact, it was an invention of extremely cheap source of energy which could close oil industry as expensive and unnecessary forever. Could buy the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, etc. Simultaneously, under the guardianship of the Soviet genius in military air and space construction Chelomey, there was achieved a serious breakthrough by means of which the USSR would outrun the US in arms racing by 30-40 years. But none of these possibilities was realized. Glushkov's system frightened the USA. According to American forecasts, were the system being installed by 1970s, the USSR would outrun the US forever. It's no surprise that in 1964, under the US President Lyndon Johnson, there was organized a group called To Stop Glushkov. But even more frightened were Soviet upper groups, the nomenclature, at least its leading part. If put in action, the Glushkov system could change the power balance in the USSR. Apart from the so-called partocracy, it led to the emergence of technocrats in power. That's why the nomenclature did its best to block the introduction of the Glushkov system, and by 1970 it became evident that it would not be enacted. As for cold thermonuclear synthesis, All works in this direction were also abandoned by the end of 1967. By that time, a powerful group emerged in the USSR who had vested interest in oil trade and consequently in the integration into the world market and in the convergence with the West. This group did its best to bury Philemonenko's program using administrative resources. Clan rivalries didn't let Chelomey to transform his invention into innovation. Chelomey's counteragents used the détente as an argument against the development of the types of weapons elaborated in his construction office. As a result, by the end of the 1960s, Soviet ruling groups in fact blocked transformation of anti-capitalism into post-capitalism and chose integration into the capitalist system. No wonder that in the mid-70s, the West seized the historical initiative from the USSR and began a counter-offensive which coincided with the neoliberal crackdown on the middle and working classes in the West itself. At first, counter-offensive against the USSR aimed just to weaken it as much as possible. But in the early 80s, the task was reformulated and came to mean destruction. The reason was very simple: grave perspectives for the capitalist system. In late 1981, Reagan gave an order to organize 3 analytical groups. The task was to work out the scenarios of development perspectives of the capitalist system, of the USA and of the USSR. These groups were headed by prominent intellectuals: Murray Gell-Mann, Nobel Prize winner and organizer of the Santa Fe Institute; Randall Collins, sociologist with close ties with the Bush family; and B. Bonner. The 3 groups were working separately from each other, but their forecasts coincided. All groups predicted a cyclical crisis for the world economy in 1987 and 1988. The crisis was to cover both capitalist and socialist segments of world economy. But unfortunately for the USA, which was to be busy with the confrontation with the USSR on the periphery of the world capitalist system, America would not be able to arrest or at least to weaken the crisis. As a result, in the early 1990s, the world economy would be hit by a depression, and its consequences would be much more serious and grave than that of 1929-1933 crisis. According to forecasts, the consequences for the West would be much harder than for the socialist camp. The decline of production by 15–20% in the West and just by 10 and 12% in the socialist segment of the world system. According to all 3 forecasts, political results would be the following: the possibility of coming to power of communists in Italy, France and Spain, of left labor in Great Britain, and mass riots on race and class base in the largest US cities. After such forecasts, the destruction of the USSR became a question of life and death for the US, for the survival of the capitalist system. What's interesting, a very pessimistic forecast for the nearest future of the capitalist system was made in the early 1980s in the USSR by Pobis Kuznetsov. According to Kuznetsov research, the functioning of capitalist economic mechanism would lead in 1993–1995 to the situation when the quantity of dollars in the world economy as compared to 1 kilowatt per hour of electric energy used in it would exceed the border magnitude. As a result, there would begin a hyperinflation of prices, commodities and assets. This means, wrote Kuznetsov, that before the end of the 20th century, the capitalist system would lie in ruins. But in historical reality, it was the USSR which was ruined, while the West got almost 20 excessive fat years, thus cheating history. How could it happen? In spite of all intentions of the West to destroy the USSR, the West couldn't do it alone. It was not strong enough for that. It had to find allies in the USSR. And it found them. In the USSR itself, at least since mid-1970s, there was a group determined to change the social order in the country. This group, a triple union, was represented by some segments of nomenclature, some segments of the KGB and shadow economy businessmen, largely of Georgian and Armenian origin. The last one having close ties with respective diasporas in France and the USA. The USSR had close ties with these diasporas through SPERK, semi-personal intelligence Armenian net organized by Anastas Mikoyan. But without Western help, the Triple Union could not capitalize the Soviet Union. It had to find allies in the West, and it found them. So they formed an international double agent with 2 heads, Soviet and Western. The larger part of the Soviet brigade didn't want to destroy the USSR totally. Perhaps it was ready just to let go some of the republics, and that's all. They wanted to change social order, but in the course of actions by the end of 1988, they lost control of the process. The West, the USA led by George Bush the Senior, got the upper hand, seized the initiative. Combined with Yeltsin factor in 1991, it led to destruction of the USSR both as of anti-capitalist order and as of a state. After that, they began the plunder of the ex-socialist zone. If in 1989, in the Eastern Europe, including the European part of the USSR, they lived 14 million under poverty line, in 1996 this number reached 168 million people. It's no surprise that in the last 3 years of Clinton's second term, the US for the first time in 30 years had a budget surplus. Due to this plunder, the capitalist system got almost 20 fat years. This was provided by three factors. First, with the end of the Cold War, the world market was flooded by cheap natural resources, hydrocarbons like oil and gas, chemical and metallic. It was the result of the privatization of Russian industry. Second, simultaneously there was an unprecedented, since the times of the Soviet industrialization, rise of foreign investment in China. Cheap Chinese products immensely favored a consumption boom all over the world. And finally, the NATO countries lowered for a while their military expenses, and a part of funds was transferred to the sphere of social programs. By 2007-2008, the basket launch of the fat years was over, and there came a crisis. It was neither solved nor overcome. It was just inundated, flooded by money. It didn't go away, just slowed down, and it will inevitably resurrect in 2020-2021. Since this crisis is not just purely structural as that of 1929-1933, it's systemic, part and parcel of a general. And I stress, systemic and not structural. In other words, terminal crisis of capitalism. How do global elites plan to overcome the crisis and to keep power, property and privileges? People are accustomed to speak of globalists and anti-globalists in contemporary world, but it's a simplification to lump all globalists together. In fact, there are at least two groups: moderate globalists and radical ones. Moderate globalists let the state exist, but as a dependent element, a function of the IMF, World Bank, etc., as a junior partner of transnational corporations. As to radical globalists, they negate the very existence of the state. Their world is the world of several extra-large corporations, like New East India companies, New Venices, etc. To realize this project, they must eliminate the USA as the strongest state. But they cannot do it while Russia and China exist. So we have very complicated world-scale conflicts, where the same actors are pursuing their goals in different spheres, and sometimes one and the same agent has contradicting goals. For example, the USA as the state, as a deep power, and as a cluster of transnational corporations. Both groups of globalists advocate the decrease of world population to not more than 2 billion people. Their social ideal is a caste-type society with restricted access to the largest part of population to education. A new edition of bread and circuses, in a kind of a soft electronic concentration camp. What are current theories of possible development of the crisis? One of them is the optimization theory, where the mankind blocks negative tendencies of development in advance. The second one is a revolutionary theory, where the mankind creates new breakthrough technologies which change the course of development drastically and progressively. But there are at least three arguments against these theories. First, the creative intellectual level of world elites is diminishing. Second, research by Swiss and Israeli scholars demonstrates that during the last 100 years, due to propaganda, mass media and strict social control, what Foucault called keep an eye on and punish, behavior of human mass has been deliberately and purposefully changing in the direction of standardization. Human diversity in the West is pushed away and supplanted by automatic and instinctive behavior of human masses. And the third factor, during the last 12,000 years, the mankind lives in long summer, which came after a long ice age. Now we stand on the verge of new ice age, let alone a high possibility of a geoclimatic catastrophe. All these factors make the optimization theory hardly probable, let alone the revolutionary one. To this, we should add that the rate of the development of world economy in the nearest 20 years will be 1.52%, the lowest since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The third theory is a theory of anthropological transition, the divergence of the mankind into two social groups, which will differ from each other as two biological species. And the final theory is a theory of catastrophe. This theory is advocated not only by many scientists and scholars, but also by many members of business, political and intelligence service elites. Yet reality is much more complicated than any plan or theory, even of those who control power, property and information. Usually, there are not one, and even not two, but a number of paths and outcomes of crisis. Different paths out of a crisis are determined by social class struggle. If we remember the crisis of the long 16th century, there were at least 3 different paths in Western Europe only. In France, the crown and the peasantry squeezed les seigneurs, thus ensuring the victory of the state. The result was a highly institutionalized state differentiated from the dominant class. That's why anti-systemic social struggle in France was directed first of all against the state, in the forms of anarchism and syndicalism. In German lands, with their relatively weak states, les seigneurs, or the Junkers, defeated the peasantry in alliance with different princes. As a result, a highly institutionalized state tightly connected with the dominant class. Hence, anti-systemic strategy here was the struggle against the dominant class for the seizure of the state from it, social democracy. In England, due to historical circumstances, the War of the Roses and the death in it of some 25–30% of aristocracy, there emerged a unique group, the gentry, an open entrepreneurial landowning class. It was a symbol of a draw between a lord and a peasant in the 15th century. The result was a weakly institutionalized state differentiated from the dominant class, hence labor movement in the 19th century. If we go beyond Western Europe, we'll see that in Asia the main way out of crisis was usually the formation of highly centralized polities, like the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Qing Empire, and the Tokugawa polity. The Russian response to crisis was the emergence of a unique, centralized structure, autocracy, which is neither Oriental despotism nor Western absolutism. Looking at current reality, I would say that at least 2 ways out of the crisis are realized in practice, and post-capitalism future is already there. It's China and Africa to the south of Sahara. In China, it's rating system. It combines traditional Chinese social control with electronic possibilities, thus realizing in practice Big Brother is watching you, and much more. In Africa, it's semi-dissolution of post-colonial state and resurrection of archaic forms of the basis of modern technology, especially military one. I would call it future archaic. As for other regions, EU, Middle East, Russia, the US, Latin America, post-capitalism future has not come here yet. But it is at the gates, like Hannibal at the Roman gates, ad portas. And the question is, which way the gates will be open, slowly or smashing with lots of blood? One should be ready for both variants, especially for the worst one. He who is alarmed is armed.